All right, so you're ready for a deep dive into the Austrian School of Economics?
I am. Let's do this.
I think a lot of people are curious about, like you said, if any countries actually use this model
Oh, yeah, definitely. It comes up a lot.
in practice. But that's a big question, one that really gets to the heart of this whole approach to economics.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, I can tell you no country is a pure Austrian school model. But to see why we really need to understand, like, what makes this school of thought tick? What makes it different?
Okay, so this is not like Econ 101, right?
Definitely not.
We're not going to, have a dry textbook definition kind of thing.
I don't know.
You've got, a stack of articles and books, and we're here to, you know, pull out the good stuff, the aha moments, the insights that make you think differently.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's about, getting those core principles of potential benefits and the downsides, and then connecting it to, like, what's happening in the real world, particularly those countries you mentioned.
Right, and maybe even spark some debates along the way.
Oh, for sure.
So let's start with the basics. What is the Austrian School of Economics all about? What are those, fundamental ideas that make it different?
So one of the most fundamental things about the Austrian school is that focus on the individual. They see the economy as driven by the choices and actions of individuals, not by some grand plan, like a central authority.
So it's not about the government dictating how things should run.
Not at all. In fact, one of the most distinctive things about the Austrian school is a skepticism of government intervention in the economy.
Oh, really? Okay.
They think that markets left to their own devices tend to create order and efficiency naturally.
That's where like the idea of spontaneous order comes in, right? And actually one of your sources uses this great analogy to explain it. Imagine like a busy city intersection. There's no single person like directing traffic, but cars manage to flow pretty smoothly, just guided by like simple rules and individual decisions.
It's a perfect illustration. Austrian economists would say something similar happens in the economy, where individuals pursuing their own interests, they create this complex web of interactions that leads to a well-functioning system.
Right. It's like there's an invisible hand guiding the market, even without a conductor leading the orchestra.
Exactly.
But how does that work in practice? I mean, we all know that markets aren't perfect.
Well, that's where the role of prices becomes super crucial. Austrian economists see prices as signals. They convey this vital information about supply demand, the value of things.
So it's not just like a random number on a price tag.
No, not at all. Prices in this view are like the language of the market. It tells producers what consumers want, how much they're willing to pay, where those resources should be allocated.
So the market talks through prices.
Yeah, you can say that.
Okay, I like that. But let's go back to that point about the Austrian school's skepticism about government intervention. Why are they so wary of the government getting involved in the economy?
Well, they think government intervention often distorts the price signals that we were just talking about. So, when the government sets prices, provides subsidies, imposes regulations, it's basically interfering with the natural workings of the market.
And that leads to all sorts of unintended consequences.
Precisely. You highlighted this passage in your notes about the Austrian economist criticizing the government response to the 2008 financial crisis. They argue that intervention, while it's well-intentioned, it actually prolonged the recession by preventing the market from correcting itself naturally.
Oh, wow. So the idea is just to like let the market work its magic even when things get tough.
It's a simplification,
Yeah.
but yeah, it kind of captures the essence of the Austrian view. They believe that, in the long run, the market is more efficient at allocating resources and solving economic problems than any government.
Okay, I see the logic here, but you mentioned earlier that no country perfectly embodies the Austrian model. So where can we see these ideas in the real world? You specifically asked about countries that reflect Austrian principles.
Yeah. Well, one place that often comes up is Hong Kong, at least before the influence of mainland China became more pronounced. It was known for its low taxes, minimal regulation, and a really thriving free market. And it's often cited as an example of how that laissez-faire approach can lead to economic prosperity.
Hong Kong's story is so fascinating. It's like this real-life experiment in free market principles, but I wonder how much of its success can be attributed to those policies versus other factors. Were there things that made Hong Kong unique?
That's a great point. It's always difficult to isolate the specific causes of any country's success. Hong Kong's history, its geography, cultural factors, they all probably played a role.
It's never a simple equation.
Exactly.
But it certainly gives us something to think about, right? Especially in the context of the Austrian school. Are there any other examples that kind of jump out?
Switzerland is another interesting case. They have this long history of fiscal conservatism, economic freedom, limited government intervention, and it's a stable, prosperous nation that's often associated with really sound economic management, which aligns with, at least some Austrian principles.
Okay, so we've got Hong Kong, we've got Switzerland, both kind of demonstrating that, some level of Austrian-inspired policies can work in practice. But what about some examples that are a little bit more controversial?
Well, Chile, under Pinochet from 1973 to 1990, they implemented a lot of free market reforms, privatization, reduction of government control, and it did lead to really significant economic growth. Yeah. But this period was also marked by a lot of political repression and human rights violations, so kind of adds this whole other layer to the analysis.
Right. It's a perfect example of how applying economic theory to the real world isn't always so black and white. There are multiple factors at play, social, political,
Absolutely.
all intertwined with the economic ones.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to look at the broader context when evaluating economic models and understand that no system is operating in a vacuum.
Right, context is key. So we've talked about Hong Kong, Switzerland, Chile, all exhibiting elements of Austrian thinking in different ways. What about the United States? Can we see any of that influence in its economic history?
We've seen how those Austrian ideas have influenced countries all over the world, but even in a large economy like the United States, there have been periods that align with that Austrian thinking, though not perfectly.
Yeah.
So, for example, the pre-New Deal era, they had less government involvement in the economy, and then later the Reagan era saw a lot of deregulation and tax cuts, both kind of reflecting aspects of those Austrian principles.
So even in like this massive complex economy like the US, we can still see glimpses of Austrian influence. But does that mean it works? I mean, the Austrian model sounds good in theory, unleashing ingenuity, letting the market decide. But does it deliver in practice? Like, does it actually lead to economic growth?
That is a great question, and one that gets right to the heart of what the Austrian school believes. They would argue quite passionately that free markets are the best way to achieve long-term sustainable growth.
All right, convince me, how does that work?
They point to a few key factors. First, they argue that free markets are just incredible breeding grounds for creativity and entrepreneurship. Individuals are free to innovate, pursue opportunities, take risks, and that drives economic dynamism and progress.
So instead of this like top-down approach where the government's trying to plan everything, the Austrian school is all about, empowering those risk takers, those innovators, and letting them kind of drive the economy from the bottom up.
Exactly. They believe that unleashing of individual ingenuity is what fuels a thriving economy. And second, they argue that free markets with minimal government interference lead to more sustainable investments. Natural interest rates, those determined by the market itself, guide investments toward genuine needs and resources, preventing those artificial booms and busts that can happen when governments get too involved.
One of your sources mentioned how Austrian economists point to the housing bubble and the crash in the 2000s as an example of what happens when interest rates are manipulated by the government.
Right.
They argue that those artificially low rates just created this distorted market that was bound to collapse eventually.
That's a key point for them. They believe that letting the market determine interest rates leads to a more stable and sustainable financial system.
It's like letting the market act as a natural thermostat, regulating the economy's temperature instead of like constantly fiddling with the controls. But wouldn't that lead to some pretty wild swings in the economy, like periods of boom and bust that could be really disruptive?
That is a concern that critics of the Austrian school often raise. They argue that the market left to its own devices can be prone to instability and that some government intervention is necessary to kind of smooth out those rough edges.
Okay, so it's not like a foolproof system. There are potential downsides.
There are, and we'll definitely delve into those as we kind of continue our deep dive. And before we get into the potential drawbacks, there's one more point I want to make about how the Austrian school views economic growth. They believe that the price mechanism plays this vital role in allocating resources efficiently and driving innovation.
We talked about that earlier, how prices act as those signals in the market, but how does that specifically contribute to growth?
Well, Austrian economists argue that when prices are allowed to fluctuate freely, they actually reflect the true value of goods and services. And this helps producers understand what consumers want, encourages them to innovate to improve their products, and it guides resources towards those areas where they're most needed.
This is this constant feedback loop between consumers and producers, all mediated through prices.
Exactly. And this, according to the Austrian school, is a key driver of economic dynamism and long-term growth. They argue that this system, driven by individual choices, price signals, and minimal government intervention, is more efficient than any central planning could ever be.
Okay, I'm starting to see the big picture here, but let's get real. No economic system is perfect. What about those potential downsides of the Austrian model? You've got a bunch of notes flagged here about economic inequality, the risk of market failures, the role of government in providing essential services. What are some of the concerns that critics of the Austrian school raise?
You're absolutely right. No system is perfect, and the Austrian school is no exception. Let's dig into some of those potential downsides you've highlighted, because they raise some important questions about how this model would actually function in the real world.
Yeah, we've talked about the potential benefits, unleashing creativity, driving innovation, letting the market guide investments. But what about those concerns about economic inequality? You highlighted an article about, rising inequality in several developed countries. And some argue that policies favoring free markets have contributed to that trend.
That's a big one, and a valid concern. Critics argue that unfettered free markets can lead to, a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, potentially creating social issues and instability. They worry that without some government intervention to redistribute wealth or provide a safety net, the gap between the rich and the poor could become too vast.
It's like that saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Is that an inevitable outcome of an Austrian style economic system?
That's a hotly debated topic, and there's no simple answer.
Yeah.
The Austrian school would argue that the best way to improve the lives of everyone, including the poor, is to create a system that maximizes overall economic growth. They believe that a free market, with its emphasis on individual initiative and innovation, is the most effective way to achieve that.
So their approach is to focus on growing the pie, assuming that everyone will benefit as the pie gets bigger.
Exactly. They believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. But critics counter that, while the pie may be getting bigger, the slices aren't necessarily being divided fairly.
It's not just about the size of the pie, but how it's sliced.
Precisely. And that's where the role of government comes into play.
Mm.
Even many proponents of free markets acknowledge that some level of government intervention is necessary to address issues like poverty, inequality, access to essential services.
That brings us to another potential downside that you flagged: the lack of public infrastructure without government involvement. Could those essential public services like education, healthcare, transportation be underfunded or neglected?
That's a concern that's often raised. Critics of the Austrian school worry that a purely free market approach would leave these vital services to the whims of the market, potentially creating disparities in access and quality.
You marked a passage in one of your sources where an economist argues that a robust public education system funded and overseen by the government is essential for creating a skilled workforce and fostering long-term economic growth. That seems to kind of contradicts the Austrian school's emphasis on minimal government involvement.
Yeah, it does highlight a key tension within this debate. Even those who advocate for free markets often recognize that there are certain areas like education where government plays an important role. The question is where to draw the line. How much government involvement is necessary to ensure a functioning society without stifling individual initiative and market efficiency?
It's a balancing act, right? Finding that sweet spot where individual freedom and collective good can coexist.
Exactly, and that leads us to another potential downside, the risk of market failures. Even in relatively free markets, things can go wrong. Monopolies can form stifling competition and harming consumers. Information asymmetries can lead to unfair outcomes, and systemic risks can build up, leading to financial crises like the one we saw in 2008.
You specifically highlighted the 2008 financial crisis in your notes. Didn't some Austrian economists actually argue that the crisis was caused by too much government intervention in the housing market?
That's right. They pointed to policies like government-sponsored mortgage lending and artificially low interest rates as creating this distorted market that was bound to collapse. They argued that the crisis was a consequence of government interference, not a failure of free markets.
Okay, so we've got two very different perspectives on the role of government in the economy. It seems like figuring out the right balance, that sweet spot we were talking about, is really the key challenge.
It is. And that's where things get really interesting. It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting any one economic model. It's about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches and then figuring out how to create a system that works best for a given society.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Not at all. What works in one country might not work in another. Cultural values, political institutions, historical context, all of these things play a role in shaping the economic landscape.
This is making me think that, understanding the Austrian school isn't just about memorizing a bunch of economic theories. It's about understanding how those theories interact with the messy realities of the real world.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's about using those theories as lenses to understand how economies function, what drives growth, and how to create systems that promote prosperity and well-being.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored those core principles of the Austrian school, from its emphasis on individual action to its skepticism of government intervention. We've looked at real-world examples where those principles have been applied both successfully and controversially, and we've delved into those potential downsides that critics of this model raise. So where do we go from here? How do we kind of synthesize all this information into something meaningful?
Well, one way to make this even more relevant to your interests is to delve into the specific work of some of the key thinkers who've shaped the Austrian school. We've mentioned a few of them in passing,
Yeah.
but it's worth taking a closer look at their contributions.
Okay, so let's give a shout out to those economic giants who've helped shape this unique approach to understanding the world. Who should we start with?
Well, we have to start with Karl Menger, considered the founder of the Austrian school. He laid the groundwork back in the 19th century with his work on the subjective theory of value, arguing that value is determined by individual preferences, not by the cost of production.
That's a pretty revolutionary idea. It shifts the focus from these objective measures to those subjective experiences of individuals. It's like saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but for economics.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone of Austrian thinking. And then we have Ludwig von Mises, who built upon Menger's work and really championed the idea of praxeology, the study of human action and decision-making.
Wait back a second. You marked praxeology in my notes, and I gotta admit, I'm a little fuzzy on what that actually means. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. Praxeology is all about understanding how individuals make choices based on their own subjective values and how those choices then shape economic outcomes. It's about getting into the minds of economic actors and understanding the logic behind their actions.
So it's like a blend of economics and psychology.
You could say that. Von Mises believed that praxeology was the key to understanding how economies really work, how those seemingly chaotic individual choices lead to those complex and often unpredictable outcomes.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this fits into the bigger picture of the Austrian school. So we've got Menger, we've got von Mises. Who else should we add to our list of Austrian all-stars?
Well, you can't talk about the Austrian school without mentioning Friedrich Hayek, another towering figure who made significant contributions to the understanding of knowledge and economics. He argued that markets are superior mechanisms for processing dispersed information and coordinating economic activity.
Ah, that ties back to the idea of spontaneous order, right? The market acts as this giant information processor, collecting and synthesizing the knowledge and preferences of millions of individuals, guiding economic activity in ways that no central planner could ever replicate.
Precisely. Hayek believed that this decentralized market-based approach to knowledge was essential for economic efficiency and innovation. He was very skeptical of government attempts to plan or control the economy, arguing that such efforts were doomed to fail because they simply couldn't match the market's ability to process and respond to information.
It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where each musician is playing a different tune. The market, on the other hand, somehow manages to harmonize all those individual actions into this symphony of economic activity.
That's a great analogy. And finally, we have Murray Rothbard, who took a more radical approach, advocating for anarcho-capitalism, a system with no government involvement in the economy whatsoever.
Whoa, that's taking the Austrian school to the extreme, no government at all. How would that even work?
It's a highly controversial position even within the Austrian school. But Rothbard argued that a truly free market could provide all the necessary services from law enforcement to national defense without the need for a state.
So he envisioned a world where private individuals and organizations would handle everything that governments typically do.
It's exactly. Rothbard's work is often considered to be on the fringes of the Austrian school, but it highlights the diversity of thought within this intellectual tradition.
Okay, so we've got Menger, von Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard, four economic heavyweights who've shaped the Austrian school and continue to spark debate and discussion today. It's amazing how their ideas developed decades ago are still relevant to understanding the economic challenges we face in the 21st century.
They've given us a lot to ponder, that's for sure, and beyond exploring their work. I'd also encourage you to delve deeper into those real-world examples we touched upon earlier: Hong Kong, Switzerland, Chile. Each case study offers a unique perspective on how elements of Austrian thinking have been applied in practice with both positive and negative outcomes.
I'm already adding those to my reading list. It's one thing to understand the theory, but seeing how it plays out in the real world with all its complexities and nuances just adds another layer of depth to our understanding.
Absolutely. It's like connecting the dots between those abstract ideas and tangible outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
It allows you to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Austrian model in a more concrete way.
All right, so we've explored the core principles, delved into the potential downsides, and met some of the key thinkers who've shaped the Austrian school. What's the final takeaway? What should our listener be pondering as they continue their own deep dive into this fascinating and often controversial approach to economics?
For me, I think the biggest takeaway is that the Austrian school, despite its reputation for being a bit radical, it really forces us to think critically about the role of the individual, the power of markets and the limits of government.
It does, it challenges a lot of conventional wisdom and it pushes us to consider, alternative ways of organizing society and the economy.
Yeah, and even if you don't agree with every single thing they say, understanding that Austrian perspective gives us a valuable framework for analyzing economic issues, debating different approaches.
Exactly. It's like adding another tool to your intellectual toolbox. At the beginning you asked about countries that reflect those Austrian principles. We explored some examples, Hong Kong, Switzerland, Chile, even the US to some extent. But it's clear that no country perfectly embodies that model.
Right, and that's partly because the Austrian school is more of like a philosophy of economics than like a rigid set of policy prescriptions, you know?
It's not a recipe book.
Exactly. It's more about understanding the underlying logic of markets and the importance of individual freedom in driving economic prosperity.
So even though there's no Austrian utopia out there, understanding the school of thought can still be incredibly valuable for anyone who wants to understand, how economies work, what drives growth, how different policy choices can shape our world.
Absolutely. It's about being an informed and engaged citizen, capable of thinking critically about economic issues and participating in, those crucial debates about how we want to organize our societies.
And that's what makes deep dives like this so rewarding. It's not just about accumulating knowledge, it's about empowering ourselves to think differently, challenge assumptions, and maybe even come up with our own ideas about how to create a better world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought-provoking question, something to kind of ponder as they continue their exploration of the Austrian school and beyond.
Let's do it. Let's get those intellectual wheels turning.
All right, listener, here it is. If you were designing an ideal economic system, what elements from the Austrian school would you incorporate and what safeguards would you put in place to address, some of those potential downsides that we talked about? It's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about engaging in that thought experiment and considering different possibilities.
That's a fantastic question. It encourages us to think critically and creatively about how we can create a system that promotes both individual freedom and collective well-being.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, that's what economics should be about, using our understanding of how the world works to create a more just prosperous and fulfilling future for everyone.
Well said.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Austrian School of Economics. We hope you enjoyed the journey. Remember, the learning doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives going.